Hello, this is Suzanne Spencerwood from Oakland University. I'm sorry I can't be with you today, but I'm happy to talk about my collegial interactions with Mary Beaudry back in the day as a sort of celebration of her very interesting life. Mary was hired by Boston University in 1980. I was hired at the University of Massachusetts, Boston in 1978. I attended some talks by archaeologists that Mary organized at Boston University. Around 1980, Mary and I served on a committee at the Massachusetts State Historic Preservation Office that was concerned with identifying types of sites important to preserve. I sometimes rode with Mary to attend conferences where each of us presented papers. Our shared interest in household archaeology led us both to be invited to give papers at the 1983 CANIA conference at Old Sturbridge Village, which was published in 1984 as a special issue on household archaeology in the journal Man in the Northeast, which is a title stemming from the old sexist notion that the term man included everyone, while it actually disappears women. Mary Beaudry's article was called Archaeology and the Historical Household, and my article was Status, Occupation, and Ceramic Indices, a 19th Century Comparative Analysis of Households. For the 1985 SHA meetings in Boston that Mary headed up organizing, I assisted in getting the word out, and I organized a large symposium that was made into two and became my 1987 edited volume, Consumer Choice in Historical Archaeology. This is a picture of the meeting place, the Heinz Convention Center, in my book. In 1987, Mary and I drove to the Kaneha Conference in St. Mary's City, where we roomed together and visited a reconstructed English colonial house and saw historic house construction methods. En route, I told Mary about the interesting feminist theory I was reading. It's something that we did on trips to different conferences. Mary also gave a ride to Ann Yench to and from the Kaneha Conference from Morven, the Stockton Historic Mansion in Princeton, New Jersey, where we stayed overnight and saw the garden excavations and artifacts, including flower pots. Richard Stockton was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and his house was trashed by British occupation during the Revolution. His letters ordered plants for the garden that were requested by his wife Annis, as Ann Yench discussed in her co-authored chapter in the 1996 Landscape Archaeology book. And these pictures are from that chapter. There's the Morven garden map and pictures of the excavations of the gardens. There was the Richard Stockton's wife's grotto that he collected shells and a Roman brick for. And this is a picture of Ann Yench more recently. In 1988, Ann Yench asked me and Mary to co-organize the SHA Women's Caucus, which first met when the 1989 SHA annual meeting was included with the AIA, APA, and the American Schools of Oriental Research in the first Joint Archaeological Congress in Baltimore, where I organized the first SHA Symposium on Gender Research in Historical Archaeology, entitled Making Women Visible Through Historical Archaeology. And this symposium included the following papers: Restoring a Female Presence, Women in Historic Preservation by Gail Dubrow, Gender Roles and Historical Archaeology, A Look at the 18th Century Fur Trade Frontier of Northern Michigan by Elizabeth Scott, The Role of Women in 18th Century Pleasure Gardens by Carmen Weber, The Ritualization of Family Dinner in New York City by Diana D. Zuriga-Wall, Putting Sex into Archaeology, Some Examples of Women's Contribution to California's Archaeological Record by Mary Pretzelis and Adrian Pretzelis, Feminist Archaeology and the Proactive Roles of Women in Transforming Gender Concepts, Roles, and Relationships in 19th Century America by me, Alternative Visions, Shaker Gender Ideology and the Built Environment by Ellen Rowles Savulis. Until Death Do Us Part, Domestic Relations in Cemeteries of Broome County, New York by Randy McGuire. So that was that set of papers. In 1988, Mary and I presented papers in the same session at the Shockmole Conference in Calgary, entitled Household and Communities, which were published in the conference proceedings in 1989. Mary's paper was entitled Household Structure and the Archaeological Record, Examples from New World Historical Sites. My paper was entitled The Community as Household, Domestic Reform, Mid-Range Theory, and the Domestication of Public Space. The 1989 Shockmole Conference on Gender in Archaeology asked Mary to organize a symposium, but she referred the conference to me. So they invited me, and I organized the first symposium on gender research in historical archaeology at an international conference. The symposium included papers by Ann Jensch and others. Let me read. My paper was entitled Towards a Feminist Historical Archaeology of the Construction of Gender. Lee Fratt gave a paper entitled A Preliminary Analysis of Gender Bias in the 16th and 17th Century Spanish Colonial Documents of the American Southwest. Carol Devon's paper was entitled Gender and Colonization in Native Canadian Communities, Examining the Historical Record. Susan Lawrence Cheney's paper was entitled Women and Alcohol, Female Influence on Recreational Patterns in the West, 1880 to 1890. Elizabeth Scott's paper was Gender in Complex Colonial Society, the Material Goods of Everyday Life in a late 18th century fur trading community. Linda Stein's paper was entitled Early 20th Century Gender Roles, Perceptions from the Farm. Ann Jensch's paper was entitled Access and Space, Symbolic and Material in Historical Archaeology, in which she talked about the British occupation of Morven and their inversion, denigration of public space through domestic actions. Carmen Weber's paper was The Genius of the Orangery, Women and 18th Century Chesapeake Gardens, and her paper was later published also in that 1996 Landscape Archaeology book. Daughters and Sons-in-Law of King Cotton, Asymmetry in the Structure and Material Culture of Cahaba and Antebellum Alabama Town was presented by Linda Derry. So those were the papers that were published in the conference proceedings. Shelley Smith also gave a paper about women pirates and navigators on ships and so forth that they mistakenly didn't put in the proceedings. I also traveled with Mary and others to the October 7th through 9th, 1989 Coneha Conference in Morristown, New Jersey. And en route, I told Mary about the interesting article I had just read in Signs by Frances Mashalese, Patricia Sharp, and Colleen Cohen, which included the concept of multiple voices. Mary used this concept in her co-authored chapter in the Archaeology of Inequality, edited by Randy McGuire and Bob Painter. And in footnote 20, she kindly thanked me and Ann Jensch with bringing it to her attention. My chapter in this book was about the social agency of women's reform movements in resisting women's domestic subordination. Mary told me about Boston University's Big Dig CRM project prior to the new downtown tunnel construction that began in 1991. And I visited sometimes in the 1990s, went to the archaeology lab to see the Big Dig artifacts. In 1994, I organized the SHA Symposium, which I titled What is Feminist Theory and What Does It Have to Do with Historical Archaeology? But I listed Mary first as co-chair because the symposium was her idea and she wanted to organize it but did not have the time to do so. The papers in the conference included Mary and mine introductory remarks, my paper on the development of feminist theory, implications for historical archaeology, Joyce Clemens's paper on gender and military sites archaeology, the methodology of feminist theory, Elizabeth Scott's paper, Looking at Gender and More, Feminist Archaeology and a 19th Century Millwright's House, Luann de Cunzo's paper on Reforming Prostitutes and Beyond, The Men, Women, and Material Culture of Magdalene Society, 1800 to 1916, Catherine Holder Spoody's paper Fun, Fortune, and Reform, Feminist Theory and Archaeology on the Way to the Klondike, Diana Diezeriga-Wall and Nan Rothschild's paper, Getting at the Facts, Equity for Women and the SHA Membership Survey, and Nicole Oak's paper, Changing Concepts of Female Pollution in Polynesia. In 1994, Mary and I each gave papers at the American Anthropological Association annual meeting in San Francisco in the symposium entitled Equity Issues for Women in Archaeology, organized by Margaret Nelson, Sarah Nelson, who invited my paper, and Allison Wiley. Mary's paper was entitled Women Historical Archaeologists, Who's Counting? My paper was entitled The Historical Archaeology Women's Caucus and the SHA Committee on Gender Issues, which later became the Gender and Minority Committee of the SHA today. Mary and I each wrote commentaries, and I wrote a chapter about the Cambridge Cooperative Housekeeping Society in the 2004 Book of Household Research, edited by Carrie Burrell and Jamie Brandon. On a trip to one conference, I showed Mary the Traveler's Restaurant Food and Books that's off of I-84 and exit 74 in Union, Connecticut, just over the line south of Sturbridge, Massachusetts, and Southbridge for that matter. Mary and I browsed the basement antique bookstore in Traveler's Restaurant, found some books of interest. I found Isabella Beaton's 1870 Book of Needlework and gave it to Mary because she expressed interest in it. And these are from left, a modern reprint of the book with a photo of Isabella Beaton, the 1870 original title page, a reprint title page, and it was a reprint that I found, and also Mrs. Beaton's Guide to Embroidery, Crochet, and Knitting. Mary used Beaton's book in her 2006 findings book and kindly thanked me in her acknowledgments. Thank you so much for listening to my trip down memory lane about the good old days when we pioneering feminist archaeologists used to travel together.